Welcome. Thank you all for coming. Thank you. Welcome to the Historical Society of Long Beach, and welcome to this great program, World War II Brings Social Change to Long Beach. It's part of our Long Beach Remembers Pearl Harbor speaker series, and you can see the exhibition around this room. I'm Julie Bartolotto, and I'm the executive director. Thank you all for being here. We have two special institutions to thank for this speaker series. First is the Long Beach Navy Memorial Heritage Association, and there are members of the board present today, so thank you very much. They funded many aspects of this project, including this newest publication of the Historical Society, written by Craig Hendricks and Dr. Julian Delgadio, A Big Change for Long Beach, World War II Transforms the City. They also funded this Points of Interest brochure that gives an overview of different sites in the Long Beach area that relate to World War II, and this was put together by Timothy Frieden, who is here, and one of the members, one of the historians on this project. I'd also like to thank California Humanities. They funded the speaker series, and thanks to them, we will have video of all of these different events during the Long Beach Remembers Pearl Harbor speaker series. We're a nonprofit organization dedicated to collecting local history and presenting programs such as this, where we bring that history to the public. We're funded through grants, memberships, and contributions from people like you, and if you're not already a member, please join, and thank you to all of you who are members. Long Beach Remembers Pearl Harbor, that project was funded by over 100 donors. And we're very fortunate to have that situation. And I need your patience while I thank some of those highest contributors to the project. Los Angeles County Supervisor Don Kanabe, the Evelyn M. Bauer Foundation, Molina Healthcare, James and Elizabeth Breslauer, the Matson Foundation, the Employee Community Fund of Boeing, the Port of Long Beach, St. Mary Medical Center, Leo and Judith Vanderland, who are here, Mike and Arlene Walter, the Miller Foundation, Nikki Tennant, the president of the HSLB, who's here. Thank you, Nikki. Behind you. Long Beach Airport, Roxanne Patmore, who is here, John Dietz, the Arts Council for Long Beach, the DeLong Family Charitable Foundation, Diane Jacobus, Don Temple Family Foundation, Joan and Joseph Van Houten, Christy Fisher and Joe Vanderhorst, John and Elizabeth Hancock, the Long Beach Convention and Entertainment Center, and Farmers and Merchants Bank. I'd like to introduce one of the historians on this project, the author of the latest publication of ours, and Long Beach City College Professor Emeritus, Dr. Craig Hendricks.
Oh, okay.
So here I'll advance to yours.
Okay. Yes. Oh. Purchase your copy today.
Yes. There you go.
Hey, great. Okay, great. Well, good afternoon, and thanks for coming out. There's another edition of our work on the effects of World War II in Long Beach. And there are many ways we can see this and many effects we can look at. And so the three of us today are going to look at various aspects of the changes in Long Beach over time. I've decided to focus on the police department. So I have a presentation here called Policing the City. And what I've done here is to try to compare the 1920s to the 1940s, using the police department as a lens by which to look at the changes that the war brought to Long Beach. There are many ways we can do this. We could look at industry, we could look at the Navy, we could look at population growth, but the police department, with its daily contact with the citizens of all levels, really gives us a kind of good look at what kind of changes happened. Also, it also was very convenient because here at the Historical Society, we have really good records. The city manager files are filled with wonderful and interesting facts about the police department in the 1920s and 1940s, and this gives us a kind of look at these things. So I'm going to focus on crime. You know, crime as a way to understand the changing reality in Long Beach. And forgive me for reading the paper because I just finished writing it, so I don't have it committed to memory. So I'll try not to bore you too much. Between 1908 and 1911, Fanny Bixby, the first female employee of the recently created city police force, would often monitor public events, watching for couples that danced too close together. She would gently tap them on the shoulder, reminding them that such contact violated Long Beach Municipal Code. It did, by the way. Fanny also patrolled the boardwalk of Long Beach's amusement zone, the Pike, along the Walk of 1,000 Lights, on the watch for untoward public displays of affection or even an unescorted female. This is 1908, remember. Not that enforcing public morality was her only concern for Long Beach. She was a very strong public advocate for civil liberties, a promoter of tolerance and equality, and most probably a sincere socialist. But she did believe in public virtue and wanted Long Beach to maintain its reputation as a place where families could visit for wholesome entertainment. The Long Beach Police Department retained its interest in public morals in the 1920s, focusing on the issues of the day, including dancing, beachwear, and alcohol, as sources of declining morality in the city. Now, did the focus of the department change over time with the growth of the city? Because remember now, Long Beach is basically a small city. We go from 17,000 people in 1910 to 55,000 in 1920. That's still a very small city. A useful comparison can be made between policing strategies employed by the Long Beach Police in the 1920s, which is a very small department, less than 100 officers, and with those developed during the World War II era, beginning in 1940-41. The resulting changes demonstrate that dramatic population growth, the pervasiveness of wartime pressures, and the influence of the federal government remade what was essentially a small-town police department into a large urban force, more than 300 members, that confronted all the problems associated with modern social and economic development in the United States. As the city grew in both size and population following World War I, the police department reacted to perceived threats to good order with the creation of a purity squad. The squad's main function was to patrol the beaches and the boardwalks to assume that no offensive displays marred the public's enjoyment. The advent of Prohibition in 1918, which outlawed the manufacture, sale, and consumption of alcoholic beverages, magnified the problems, as you can imagine, faced by authorities across the nation. Police Chief Butterfield in Long Beach, who had focused on public displays of affection, warning that shimmying and cheek-to-cheek dancing would not be tolerated in Long Beach under any circumstances, in 1917, 1918, now turned his attention to a more pressing problem. The city's probation officer, first probation officer, Mrs. Agnes Stilson, reported in 1922 that young girls aged 14 to 18 ran away from homes more frequently. She placed the blame for this on developing social issues such as bobbed hair, poor parental supervision, short skirts, alcohol, and most importantly, the growing availability of automobiles. Long Beach went from less than 500 automobiles to over 5,000 automobiles by the mid-20s. So that creates all sorts of problems. Mrs. Stilson also reported that many of Long Beach's 11 movie theaters featured silent pictures that depicted young men drinking, smoking cigarettes, and riding in automobiles with young women. A very troubling sign. Alas, these troubling signs were merely the early indicators of problems ahead for the guardians of the city. By December 1923, the police department was arresting an increasing number of miscreants, almost all having to do with illegal alcohol. That month, 66 of the 80 arrests involved liquor violations of National Volstead Act, which is prohibition, and the newly amended Long Beach City Charter, which made it illegal to drink as well. Drinking in public, public intoxication, and transporting illegal alcohol constituted the main offenses. However, the police department noticed that a fiscally attractive fine structure began to emerge from these arrests. Long Beach judges offered offenders $100 or 100 days in jail, or $400 and 180 days in jail for repeat offenders. Almost all paid the fines that day that they were arrested, and since many of the same names reappear in police reports for 1923, 24, and 25, would have to assume a certain familiarity between the police department and bootleggers. Okay, so here's an example of that. Oops. Oh, sorry. There we go. All right, so this is now just for alcohol. This is just for alcohol, right? So in 1923, 271 arrests, $30,000 in fines, 3,000 gallons of illegal alcohol seized. Most of it, by the way, bourbon. Okay, 1924, 879 arrests, 57,000, 1,200 gallons, and now they're finding stills, almost all of them in North Long Beach. So 22 stills. And by 1925, as you can see, up to 60,000, 6,000 gallons, 14 stills. Now, if you add these totals, you come up with about 1/4 of the annual budget of the Long Beach Police Department. I really looked. I couldn't find any notation in this documents where someone said, this is a really good idea. But clearly, the number of arrests indicated, shall we say, the fiscal possibilities were pretty clear. So fines played a major role. Such fines could be written off as the cost of doing business in business-friendly Long Beach in the 1920s. After all, this was a national phenomenon, and federal authorities moved very slowly to attack the illegal alcohol problem. So the Volstead Act, prohibition, goes into effect in 1919. But the federal government really didn't take much interest in it until the early 20s, so 1921, 22, even 1923. That's when the newly created Federal Bureau of Investigation, J. Edgar Hoover, realized, like the Long Beach Police Department, that there was money to be made. And now the FBI and the federal government became very interested in suppressing alcohol. As you know, this sets off this whole 10-year struggle between 1923 and 1933 to control alcohol. And if you guys are old enough, you remember the Untouchables, Elliot Ness. Elliot Ness was very touchable, apparently. Yeah, since the 1960s, a number of really high-quality books by historians have pointed out that the Untouchables really took a lot in bribes and so on and so forth. And, you know, well, another hero vanished anyway. So federal authorities moved very slowly until such activities began to attract front-page stories in newspapers and facilitated the rise, and this is the real thing that happened, facilitated the rise of organized criminal gangs to support alcohol. Now, you know, what Prohibition really did was to create organized crime in the United States. I mean, any historian who studies that pretty clearly figures that out. We didn't suppress alcohol, didn't stop alcohol, but we did create organized crime as a result. As Al Capone once commented in Chicago, "I'm a businessman, I see a need and I filled it." The idea that professional bootleggers, that is, sellers of illegal alcohol, might operate with impunity in community seems borne out by some of the statistics from the 1920s. And here we go. And so the growing number here, of course, represents more and more fines. News stories about police activity generated letters to the city manager decrying the lax moral condition of the city. Quote, "Crime seems to be on a fast move in Long Beach. We should ask citizens to act as lookout and report questionable people to the police." To meet the rise in alcohol-related crimes, the department reformed its vice squad. Now, there was a vice squad in Long Beach, but was concerned with things like dancing too close. Now the vice squad in 1923 becomes dedicated into 3 units cracking down on bootlegging. And by early 1926, there were 5 squads in action. You can see 927 arrests. So this represents about, as I say, about 1/4 the police budget. Given the number of arrests and activities by the booze squads, as they were known by the newspapers, a certain familiarity begins to appear in arrest records by desk sergeants on duty. I have great affection for Long Beach desk sergeants because they wrote down everything. They have the greatest comments on some of this stuff coming in. My personal favorite is Sergeant Harry Harvey. On July 31, 1925, he wrote, "Officers Springer, Ness, Jones arrested Arthur Richards. This is good work because this is the father of all bootleggers in our Virginia City district. He is a mixer of that poison called liqueur d'apricot from France. In other words, pure moonshine with apricot syrup. A big seller in Long Beach, apparently." August 5th, 1925. Officers arrested Lacey Hale and J.W. Pollock. This bunch of leggers has been working for some time, and they have been in jail on the same offense many times. Okay, on June 7th, 1925, Sergeant Harvey wrote, officers arrested one James Endo of the Tokyo Cafe for possession of 8 gallons of that famous drink, sake, that he was going to serve as joy water in his cafe. Another fine resort gone to hell. Sergeant Harvey began to recognize familiar faces and names as the booze squad became more active in the city. Officers arrested our old friend Mary C. Flippin, as she went, a female bootlegger, as she went to court, pled guilty and got $500 or 500 days. She paid. All of which led Sergeant Edgar Hill, as the head of the vice squad, including the booze squad, to boast in a letter to the city manager in 1925, this year's activities superseded all records in previous years, and with the aid of 2 miniature automobiles, and that really flummoxed me, 2 miniature automobiles. What could he be talking about? I have no idea. So if any of you know what a miniature automobile is and why it would help the police, and I'd like to know about that. 2 miniature automobiles. We were exceedingly fortunate in establishing this record. There were certainly more arrests in 1925, not only for alcohol, but there were 94 gambling arrests, 18 vagrancy arrests, and a new category, 16 motor vehicle violations. So what does this tell us about the city? Was it more violent with crime on the upswing, as the letter writers to the local newspapers claim, or more simply, does this trend reveal better and more professional record keeping? By 1925, Long Beach's population had grown to 100,000, a big change since 1910 census charted about 17,500 souls in the city, drawn by new jobs in the harbor area, new industries that followed the major oil strike in 1921 on Signal Hill, and the evolution of the city into a Southern California tourist attraction. Housing boom began in the early decade and persisted into 1928. The city was definitely enjoying an economic boom, with new neighborhoods springing up on land that had just a few years earlier had grazed cattle or produced vegetables and wheat, and the city harbor welcomed new businesses every day. And so this indicates that as the city grew, there was more and more difficulty in terms of controlling the amount of illegal activity. However, gambling was also a problem. Gambling and other big city sins also concerned the city council and the police department. City's manager Charles Henderson was new on the job in 1926, and he received complaints about card rooms as early as 1926. The city had licensed 26 card rooms by the mid-1920s, where players could try their luck at gin rummy, pinochle, and solo. With a beachhead established in the city, gambling operations blossomed. Pinball machines began appearing in restaurants, bars, and even grocery stores, paying out both cash and prizes to the players. By 1940, there were over 700 pinball machines operating, taking in about $275,000 annually in Long Beach, and that's a lot of money in 1940, according to one publication. On the plus side, this activity provided jobs for over 300 Long Beach citizens. Bridge parlors also appeared, offering bridge parlors, cash prizes to the winning teams. Like $100. Again, a lot of money. Larry A. Collins, a longtime editorial columnist for the Long Beach Independent, writing in 1969, recalled that many in town believed that gambling operations were run by the Los Angeles racketeers who moved in and controlled them, which, by the way, is true. This situation became so disgusting with apparent city corruption that the city council outlawed the games in 1940. However, the biggest headache for the city, besides alcohol and beachwear and gambling, the biggest headache for the city officials during this era could be found floating 3 miles off the coast. Gambling ships appeared right after World War I, and by 1930, a dozen or so converted lumber ships and barges plied the region's coastal waters with impunity, offering roulette and card games among many attractions, including illegal alcohol. Although local and state authorities tried to restrict access to the ships, an army of attorneys filed lawsuit after lawsuit for the owners of the gambling ships, such as the SS Joanna Smith and the Caliente and the Monte Carlo, to stop any municipal or county ordinance or even a state law that targeted the ships, citing freedom of association, freedom of speech, various other constitutional arguments. The lawyers kept the gambling fleet safe for 15 years. They were finally put out of business, by the way, at the advent of World War II, and the Attorney General Earl Warren shut them down as a security risk. An interesting aspect of this business lay in the fact that water taxis became a critical element, getting eager customers out to the ship. Every harbor from Wilmington to Orange County offered multiple water taxi companies, providing pleasant 30-minute rides at $1 a head, out to the ships. Indeed, the Long Beach police counted more than 400 cars parked in the popular harbor lot next to the water taxi quay. One informed source claimed that a busy ship could average $40,000 to $50,000 a week in gambling profits. Again, a lot of money. Caterers sold hot foods on the docks, and newsboys peddled the late editions of the Press-Telegram as gamblers waited for their turn in the taxis. Outraged citizens blamed the city for failing to rein in the water taxi business. Reverend George Rourke of the First Presbyterian Church in Long Beach charged, "City officials have connived in the operation of the gambling ships. I charge the city council with being in cahoots." He really said cahoots. "With the gambling ships, because a permit has to be given by the council for the city bus to run to the landing place of the water taxis. Don't tell me," he continued, "that the hell-born gambling ships floating just outside the limits could carry on their nefarious business without the help of Long Beach city officials." You can imagine the front page of the Press-Telegram. The good Reverend, however, was forced to retract his accusations a week later when no evidence of a bus permit could be found, and a city attorney patiently explained that judges had ruled local anti-gambling ordinances to be unconstitutional. So, gambling, illegal alcohol, booze, gambling ships, oil money, new citizens. Long Beach definitely shed its sleepy town, the resort town reputation by the 1930s. No longer would it simply be a place where winter-weary Midwesterners camped on beautiful beaches, listening to talks on the Bible, great books on the advances of scientific inquiry. Our Iowa by the Sea reputation faded slowly, pushed aside by the hurly-burly of war, oil money, new neighborhoods, and demon rum. If there is one event, however, that sort of, in a very large way, characterizes the changing sensibilities in Long Beach in the 1920s, it would be beauty parades. As an example of Long Beach's changing public sensibilities, of events that announced to the world that the city continued to reinvent itself, the 1925 Beauty Parade offers a glimpse into the future. The Amusement League, which represented most of the city's waterside attractions, decided to organize the contest and set up viewing stands on the pike and on the beach. It drew over 200,000 spectators and dozens of participants who vied for cash prizes. Again, cash prizes. A dozen Hollywood film stars acted as judges. The event drew even larger in 1926 and 1927, drawing more attention from the film studios. Local churches were not pleased. Dr. Frank Roach, pastor of the First Methodist Church, warned in his sermons that the beauty contest was merely junk and should be stopped. Long Beach should be left for chastity, honor, and purity, he warned. And he told his flock to stay away from the big event. Letters to the editors complained of commercialized vulgarity, doubling insulting as its opening fell on Sunday, the Sabbath. Another writer detected a more sinister motive behind the contest, quote, "to get more material for the motion picture business." Charles Service added, "Certainly we do not want to have our young people drawn into the vicious net of Hollywood." This criticism fell on deaf ears, apparently. By 1927, 850 contestants competed in 6 divisions for prizes ranging from $100 to $250, and now it was known as the Long Beach Moving Picture Pageant and Beauty Parade, drawing Hollywood attention. In fact, some of the winners of this Long Beach parade actually ended up in the silent movies. The event eventually transitioned into the Miss Universe pageant that brought the city much global publicity in the 1950s. So the era between Fanny Bixby Smith tapping dancers on the shoulder for shimmying too close in 1910, and thousands of men, if contemporary photographs are accurate, ogling young women in beauty parades judged by Hollywood stars can be seen as a transition. A growth period for the city became less as it became less of a small town and more of a big city, and the years of World War II cemented this transition. There's a great photograph of one of these beauty parades, and these young women are walking on this board plank, surrounded by thousands of men. Yeah, okay, I can see why Dr. Rourke might be nervous about this. Thank you. Okay. So what changes then? In the 1940s, the police department grew and tripled its size, and by the summer of 1942, they had new sets of worries to think about. One of the things they were really worried about is the sudden appearance of servicemen in Long Beach, really for the first time in large numbers. A new Navy base opened on Terminal Island that would train 40,000 young sailors by the end of the year, and Police Chief Lentz reported that the city's population increase had led to more petty crimes such as simple assault and theft, but he expressed a greater frustration over the fact that many newcomers displayed wholesale disrespect for minor law infractions. Against this backdrop of demand for increased police services, Chief Lentz noted that the loss of personnel meant the remaining officers were now required to put in 48-hour work weeks with mandatory overtime. One solution would be the increased presence of the Navy Shore Patrol, he suggested, with the help of thousands of young sailors visiting from downtown bars. Entrepreneurs saw the possibilities, and dozens of new bars opened up all over Long Beach, very attractive to 17 and 18-year-old sailors away from home for the first time. And so this led to all sorts of problems, but sort of the emphasis now moves from, patrolling the beach and watching for beachwear and gambling now to how to deal with this huge influx of other people. And so in the years 1943, 44, and 45, the Long Beach Police Department and the Shore Patrol fought endless battles with local bars and restaurants over serving alcohol to underage sailors. In one case, the California Board of Equalization finally closed the Harris Cafe on Long Beach Boulevard, or American Avenue, after a record 437 arrests for public intoxication. 438 arrests for public intoxication in 2 months in 1942. They must have been staggering out of the bar, out of the restaurant. And so it really changes a lot. And let me just do one other thing here. Statistics from the city prosecutor's office confirm that increased cases involving vice complaints as well. So alcohol, young sailors, what do you suppose happens next? Summarizing the work done by his office in 1943, Albert C.S. Ramsey, who was the city prosecutor, reported more vice complaints were issued for any other time in Long Beach history, 5,964, and prostitution cases topped 100 per month throughout the war. However, he added, it should be noted that practically none of these arrests involved commercialized vice. Oh, thank God. Which is almost non-existent in Long Beach. Sensing perhaps that his reassuring conclusion might be at odds with arrest statistics, Ramsey offered the following possible cause and effect solution. Many young girls, he said, are attracted to Long Beach by the presence of servicemen. In fact, the number of prostitution cases per month increased almost 4 times on the 1941 figures. Whether this activity represents commercialized or individual initiative, the figures indicate a sea change in public morals in the city. The prosecutor offered no remedies for this upswing. So the war creates major problems, population growth, new industries, and in fact the city now is flooded with thousands upon thousands of sailors and Marines, Coast Guardmen, and the policing, because of its daily contact with all elements of the population, its mandate to preserve public order, offers a way of understanding the effects of events as well as social and economic changes over time. In this case, from the 1920s to the 1940s, Chief Lentz faced the same kind of issues that Chief Butterfield faced, but also with new and quite serious problems brought to the city by the reality of war. Reading his comments about the city in 1943 and 1944, one senses a leader trying to cope with enormous change and not having too much success. Thanks a lot. I forgot to show you my slides. Sorry. So, Prohibition. And of course, this was the main attraction. People come to the sea, obviously. This is it, the Long Beach Beauty Parade. Look at that, isn't that great? Here they are, completely surrounded by a sea of guys in straw hats. That would make me very nervous, but anyway. And participants in the beauty parade. Yeah. So we go from here. I don't know. These guys from Long Beach Amusement. President of the Long Beach Amusement League. They ran the beauty parade. Sorry? No, that's not him. Okay, and finally, and we go into 1940s. Now it's a different problem. Thousands upon thousands of young sailors away from home for the first time. Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Craig. Next, I'd like to introduce another historian who's worked on the Long Beach Remembers Pearl Harbor project, Kaye Briegel. Dr. Briegel has done many worked on many historical projects of the Historical Society, cemetery tour scripts, author of several different histories of Bixby Land Company. Thank you very much for being here today, Dr. Kaye Briegel.
Yes, well, I get to talk about people who were discriminated against during the war to fit in with the exhibit you see around you. Sort of. I mean, it's difficult to figure out how this all worked. So, but this is my PowerPoint presentation. I chose it because it tells you about my personal experience with World War II. That's my uncle. He was in the Coast Guard, and that's me. And it's about 1943. So I chose this because it shows that I don't really remember World War II as a personal experience. On the other hand, I'm not really a baby boomer. I'm too old for that. But I grew up around people who lived through the war, and it influenced their lives. And many of them like to talk about it. Craig has reminded us that many of those who were involved in combat didn't really want to talk about it after the war, but my own experience is that people who were civilians and even people who were involved in combat like to talk about things that didn't really involve combat. So there was a lot of talk. In addition, I've been involved in preparing the exhibit you see around you. And it led me to reconsider some of the things that I believed about the war. I had to think about World War II over my life because I taught U.S. history surveys and California history. But now I've discovered some new aspects about the impact on Long Beach. I long wondered why the war made such a big impact on Long Beach, and I think one of the reasons was the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor was what drew the country into the war, and the United States had never fought a war in the Pacific before. And I've learned a lot about the war in the Pacific as a result of Tim's work. But you know, people might say, real military historians might say, well, what about the Spanish-American War and the Battle of Manila Bay? And I'm not a military historian, but I still think that was kind of small potatoes, that it didn't really lead to a buildup of the Navy in the Pacific. And so when World War II came, the building had to kind of start from a low place. When the U.S. entered the war, Southern Cal, it was a perfect place to build bases, and it was also the place where there was the technical infrastructure to build large number of airplanes in a short amount of time. So the exhibit that you see around you shows Long Beach as a center of all this activity and shows how it changed the city. All that construction, and in addition to adapting other facilities, drew, as Craig just told you, a lot of new people to town. They found us, but what they found was a city that was about 98% white. Most of the people in Long Beach, I think, didn't really think about that. They didn't think that maybe this meant Long Beach wasn't like every place else. And the war was one of the things that made people realize that Long Beach wasn't really, that being this city of white people meant Long Beach wasn't like every place else. And today, many of us are aware that we live in a multiracial and multi-ethnic country. So sometimes it's hard for us to acknowledge that at the beginning of the war, this was a much more racist country than it is now. One example, right after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, Japanese citizens and Japanese Americans were incarcerated. Enough people believe that no matter how long people of Japanese descent lived in the United States or how much they seemed over several generations to have become part of our country and society, they still couldn't be trusted. And they were suspected of treason with no other proof than the race of and the nationality of their ancestors. For another example, the U.S. Armed Services were segregated. For those of us old enough to remember the war in Vietnam, this seems hard to fathom. We can remember anti-war protesters marching to make the point that a higher percentage compared to their numbers in the population of members of ethnic and racial minorities, African Americans, Mexican Americans, American Indians, were drafted into the infantry in the war in Vietnam and died in larger numbers than other people. But at the beginning of World War II, things were different. African Americans in the Navy were relegated to serving food and cleaning up after other sailors. In the Army, they were recruited into the Quartermaster Corps, and so they loaded and unloaded all kinds of transport material, including ammunition. So if you're saying to yourself, wait a minute, they weren't in combat, this was easier than being in combat, loading and unloading ammunition turned out to be really dangerous, and there was a big explosion in San Francisco, in fact, that killed a bunch of people. So anyway, at the beginning, so the military was segregated, and at the beginning of the war, there were no African American Marines. That came, well, okay. So not that many African American sailors visited the local base in Long Beach when they were preparing to be sent to fight in the war, but some did, and as Tim has found for us in obscure sources, there was either a battalion or a regiment or a division of African American soldiers at Fort Ross, loading and unloading ships to go off into the Pacific. And many others came to town to take civilian jobs. Ernie McBride, that the new high school is named for, came to Long Beach to work in civilian jobs during the war. In Long Beach, they found a small resident community and not very many recreational facilities. And Craig has reminded us that they were looking for recreational facilities. One of the places that they found was the Congo Club. It was located on Esther Street, which is west of Esther Street is in other places, but this particular place was west of Seaside Hospital and in a neighborhood surrounded by industrial sites. The Congo Club was operated by a lodge of Prince Hall Masons. Yes, there had been separate African American Masonic lodges in the US since 1784, so Long Beach was in the first place. And they had a lodge hall next to the Congo Club. The Congo Club advertised in the local Independent, promising, and one of the interesting things about doing this research is that almost all of the ads for, or even stories about African Americans in the newspaper during the war were in the Independent and not in the Press-Telegram. So I don't really know that this is racism. Maybe it's just snobbery, but the I think the Press-Telegram was reporting news for the establishment, perhaps. Anyway, the club advertised in the Independent promising, quote, Harlem and Long Beach. And there were 2 floor shows nightly and featuring, quote, laugh-provoking novelty acts. And they also, end quote, and they also specialized in Southern fried chicken dinners. Because wartime factories operated around the clock, they even had, they had 2 floor shows at night and a matinee. It's not clear that the club only appealed to African Americans. I think they tried to appeal to everyone. And maybe the Congo Club was the one place in Long Beach where blacks and whites could dine and be entertained in the same place. If the Congo Club sounds a little racy for Long Beach, especially after you heard Craig, then I agree. Long Beach was a town, as he said, that didn't legally serve alcohol until after the end of Prohibition in 1933. So again, following up on what he said, after the war, the Independent reported that the Congo Club was being investigated by local authorities. I suspect C.S. Ramsey was the guy. And they were accused of having, quote, objectionable acts. It wasn't, The Independent wasn't specific about what that meant, but it must have been horrible, right? Perhaps to keep local African or visiting and local African Americans on the straight and narrow, the city and the YMCA encouraged the USO to establish a quote, Negro, end quote, servicemen's club in Long Beach. Although some USOs were integrated, like the well-known Hollywood Canteen, where people in some parts of the country were scandalized that actresses from Hollywood danced with African-American servicemen. Anyway, there was still, as that my story indicates, there was still prejudice. And the USO organization recognized this by forming clubs that were specifically targeted for African-American soldiers and sailors. The one on Long Beach was on Anaheim, and it was organized and managed by Mae Mack, who had come to Long Beach during the war and because her husband was in the military. At about the same time as concern about juvenile delinquency in the general population rose, the local recreation department opened a teen club for, quote, Negro, end quote, youngsters on California Avenue. That became later known as CalRec. And even later than that, as, you know, as they continued to worry about what teenagers were up to, they opened a teen club for white teenagers in the same general area, and it was called the Hutch. Anyway, segregation of African Americans and incarceration of Japanese American citizens were all consistent with national policies. But not all national policies fit well in California. Chinese Americans, for example, were the first group specifically barred from integrating to the US and excluded from applying for citizenship. Once the war started, however, and the country of their ancestors was fighting against Japan, they were welcomed into defense jobs. And there was even a Chinese American chapter of the American Women's Voluntary Association in San Francisco. During the war, the exclusion law was changed to allow Chinese Americans to become citizens, but they still weren't welcome as immigrants. Mexican Americans present an even more perplexing problem. In the 1930s, even as some of them were forced to repatriate, that is, return to Mexico, Los Angeles was widely reported to have the largest population of Mexicans, quote, outside of Mexico City. During the war, they seemed like the Japanese Americans in Hawaii who weren't incarcerated because the economy would have collapsed without them. Similarly, Mexican Americans were essential to the local economy of Southern California and, in fact, the whole Southwest. And it turned out that they were critical in helping draft boards throughout the Southwest meet their quotas, because even though large numbers of Mexican American men volunteered to join the military and fight America's enemies, they were still drafted in large numbers and filled those quotas. And the military was apparently happy to enlist them. They even enlisted men who had repatriated to Mexico but volunteered to come back and help out with the war. I can't explain how the segregated military was so happy to enlist Mexican Americans. Mexican Americans, like African Americans, were often discriminated against in housing. Some of the covenants that were used to keep African Americans and Asian Americans out of, quote, white, end quote, neighborhoods were also used to deny Mexican Americans housing. Some Mexican American children attended segregated schools, that some were segregated by neighborhoods, and children who lived in neighborhoods that were integrated were often put in special Americanization classes, separate from white children. Despite their numbers in Los Angeles, there were no Mexican Americans on the LA City Council, but they were welcomed into the military. And it all kind of happened quietly. By the end of the war, people were kind of surprised that there were a higher percentage of Mexican Americans with Purple Hearts compared to their number in the population than any other group. In Long Beach, Mexican Americans had always been the largest minority from the time the city was incorporated. And there was even a larger number of them in the unincorporated farmlands that surrounded the city. In addition to doing farm labor, Mexican Americans laid the tracks for the PE trolleys, they laid the tracks for the Southern Pacific and Terminal Railroads, and did all kinds of other laboring jobs. During the war, they continued to provide labor for all of these and other essential tasks. They lived in many parts of town, but some were concentrated in at least 2 barrios. One was in or near what's now calling itself Zafaria, around the Mexican Methodist Church on Redondo near State Street, PCH. And another was near Nuestra Señora de Guadalupe, and yes, some of the best Chicanos historians in America have told me how bad my Spanish is, so. On State Street near Orange. The school district at one time had a special, even Americanization school there as well. Advertisements even in the Independent didn't mention several separate clubs featuring Mexican American entertainers. Even restaurants offering Mexican food didn't appear to be trying to attract Mexican American servicemen who might be away from home and hungry for authentic Mexican food. Neither did the USO or the city create special programs for them. And you might expect the recreation department to create a teen club similar to the one for African Americans that they created on California Avenue. During the war, Mexican American teenagers who wore zoot suits were the target of nearly hysterical publicity. They were called pachucos and characterized as thugs who attacked people on the street to steal money or just to beat them up. Providing recreation to keep such young people off the streets apparently wasn't something that the local recreation department believed would be useful. In Long Beach, young men wearing zoot suits were routinely denied entrance to dances in the auditorium and other events in town. Apparently, Mexican American servicemen and civilian war workers who were dressed unprovocatively were admitted. And in Los Angeles, Mexican Americans, similarly unprovocatively dressed, were welcomed in music venues, including some that refused to admit African Americans. As I've been trying to demonstrate, California wasn't consistent in exercising their prejudices. And there was yet another group that was subject to discrimination and prejudice. They were derisively called Okies. You probably know that these are people who migrated to California from Oklahoma and other states in the middle of the country when the Dust Bowl, a big drought, made farming in their previous homes impractical. In California, these people who had worked on farms found work as migrant laborers. That was a marginal existence. They had no permanent residence and no guarantee that there would be another job once they finished picking a crop in one area. During the Depression, there were so few jobs available that farmers could pay them barely subsistence wages. Newspapers and other media, nevertheless, blamed the Okies for their marginal existence and claimed that their reliance on county medical and other services overtaxed longtime residents. When the war started, Okies saw new opportunities. Young men were drafted, but older men and women found work in factories, making war-related goods. The new jobs offered steady employment and paid higher wages than agricultural work. Okies became a significant but formally uncounted part of our community. Though they appeared to be white, some people still believe they were not as respectable as more longtime residents of Long Beach. When I was a little older than this, I remember people joking about Okies and saying that an Okie gas tank was a siphon. Are we all old enough to know that this means they thought Okies were too lazy and and poor to buy gasoline out of other people's cars, yes. My own mother, when she saw a car going by with a mattress lashed on the top, she said, "There goes an Okie." If there was a mattress in a box spring, she said, "There goes a rich Okie." John's not here, okay. And Okies influenced entertainment in town as well. In Long Beach, especially in areas of relatively less dense housing, such as North Long Beach, which we heard about some of the other things that were going on there from Craig, there were clubs and roadhouses that featured country music. The Independent ran ads for these establishments on the same page with the ads for the Congo Club. And usually that wasn't the same page as the ads for restaurants and clubs downtown that were seeking to attract military officers and factory managers. Now, you may be asking yourself, what happened to the agricultural jobs that the Okies were quick to abandon when they heard about better opportunities? The answer was the Bracero Program. The U.S. made an agreement with our neighbor, Mexico, to send laborers to the U.S. to perform jobs U.S. workers didn't want. In return, the U.S. guaranteed that braceros would be provided places to live while they worked here, and once they returned home, employers wouldn't try to withhold their wages. Sometimes the U.S. enforced these rules, and sometimes they didn't. But it was Mexicans, not Mexican Americans, who were recruited to replace Okies in the fields as farm laborers. Mexicans, it seemed at the time, could be more easily sent home when they weren't needed anymore. The other group that was often treated as second-class citizens before the war were women. One reason Okies were able to get jobs so easily is that employers gearing up to make war material and other industrial products for World War II first tried to hire white men. They assumed that these were the workers who had the innate skill to build ships and airplanes. They assumed that neither African-American nor Mexican-American men could learn to do these jobs. And certainly they didn't think women could do them. But when production deadlines drew nearer and the work wasn't getting finished, they began to reconsider. And of course, a presidential order to hire people without regard to race or national origin helped change their minds as well. In Long Beach, women took all kinds of jobs. They were most celebrated for their role as Rosie the Riveter, making airplanes at Douglas Aircraft Plant. But there were many other jobs in which they demonstrated that they were fully competent to perform as many industrial jobs as anyone else. During the war, women demonstrated they could accomplish things that previously had been considered only men's jobs. After the war, they began to seek leadership roles and took over positions on the city council, school board, and other policymaking bodies. The same was true for African Americans and Mexican Americans and newly freed Japanese Americans. These new leaders have brought Long Beach closer to being an international city than the people who wrote that slogan imagined. Thank you.
Thank you, Kaye. That was wonderful. Next, one of our newest board members, Dr. Jack Humphrey, will speak. He is a retired professor of geography, and he's also retired from the City of Long Beach Planning Department. Jack.
That was in my younger days. Long Beach during World War II underwent a major transformation. It was foreshadowed by an earlier growth spurt and followed by an even more dramatic change in the population of Long Beach. We can see the first one occurred in the 1920s. We might label this, for the sake of simplicity, oil. There was another one in the 40s, 50s, and early 60s that we might call war. There was a third one from about 1980 to early 2000s, and we might call that immigrant. These were three major periods of growth in population within the city. And between them, we find periods of growth, but much slower growth. So that we see in 1890, when the city was just beginning, there were only about 600 or fewer people in the city. By the time we get to the 2016 estimate, we're approaching 500,000 people, about 480,000 people. So this has been a very dramatic period of change within a relatively short span of years. This, of course, was at one time Spanish ranchos. Long Beach largely was formed out of Rancho Cerritos and Rancho Alamitos. In 1880, a British gentleman named William Wilmore came here. He was a developer, and he saw an opportunity, he thought, to create a new town at the mouth of the Los Angeles River. He subsequently then, in 1882, formed the city, Wilmore City. It attracted, after he developed it, laid it out, about a dozen households. It was not a great success by any means. And as a result, Mr. Wilmore took off for Arizona and what he hoped were greener pastures. In 1888, we have about a dozen people still here, still trying to make a go of it, and they attracted about 50 new households, and they decided to change the name from Wilmore City to Long Beach to take advantage of the great beaches that existed here. So that, and incidentally, these slides will show you up here the year, the population, which I hope you can read, and then below it eventually will be the percent of growth since the previous census period. So we can see that Wilmore City, now Long Beach, occupied a very small area here at the base of the Los Angeles River. And the population was very modest in size. This area around Long Beach was still pretty much open country. There were a few communities that developed around the area that were small communities. And fortunately, in 1902, the Red Line came in and began to connect these. And many people really aren't aware that this was a really extensive network. It stretched all the way from the San Fernando Valley down into Orange County and all the way out to Riverside. So this was a tremendous transportation system which unfortunately was to disappear. So that in the case of Long Beach, there was a red line that came down right to Ocean Boulevard and fronted onto the beaches. As a result, Long Beach became known as a beach city. It was sort of the West Coast equivalent of Atlantic City, I thought without the gambling, but as Professor Frederick showed us, there was more gambling than I was aware of, certainly. So that this became a very great destination. It was sort of a beach city, and it attracted some movie stars. Clark Gable and Carole Lombard had a house down on Ocean Boulevard near Alamitos, and it was a great resort area, very popular, especially in the summertime, to come down and enjoy the beach and the cooler air. In the case of 1910, the city had begun to expand, and incidentally, the maps I'm using are current boundaries because there are no digital maps from this period. So that the city had expanded north and east, and in fact, Long Beach between 1902 and 1910 was the fastest growing city in the United States. It had tremendous growth, and as you can see, it grew by over 3,000% from the previous census. Of course, this is a small base, so it doesn't take a lot to get 3,000 people, or 3,000%. And of course, the Pike was formed, and became a very popular location, adding to the growth of the city, people coming down to work here and to visit. In the case of 1920 census, Long Beach census showed 99% white population. Now, it's not clear, especially given what was said about Mexican Americans being here, whether this included Mexicans in the white category or the other races. The census was very strange. It had 4 categories of population: white natives, white foreign-born, Negroes, and other races. So it's not clear. In 1940, there's a footnote that says that Mexicans were included within the white, but it didn't say whether it was within white foreign-born or white native. But certainly the white foreign-born was a very diverse group, almost all European countries represented by people living in Long Beach. The port was also created in this era and began to add to the draw of residents to the city. 1920, we see a very marked change in the city, particularly in terms of the area of the city. This was a period of perhaps the greatest expansion of area within the city, as we'll see in a moment. And in 1921, when oil was discovered, it was in fact one of the largest oil fields in the world. And it produced tremendous wealth. The city of Long Beach was reported to have earned about $1 million a month from the oil revenues coming in. This great wealth, of course, spurred some to create the city of Signal Hill and keep the money for themselves, because Signal Hill, of course, had a very large field of derricks and wells. We find that while Long Beach had had naval presence here from the beginning of the 20th century, in fact, at one time had a submarine base here, this was sort of in and out. It never really became a major naval center. But in 1939, with war beginning to appear in China with the Japanese and with the sense that things were not going well in the Western Pacific, the Navy decided to make Long Beach a major facility. And in fact, they created the Naval Operating Base Long Beach and created some dry docks and began to build some naval facilities. With the outbreak of war, however, this base really expanded. There was a Marine barracks, there were new piers, there was underground oil storage tanks, there were training facilities for sailors, and it became a major departure point for those naval personnel headed for the Pacific Theater. So that it made a marked change in the city of Long Beach's population. If we take a look at the 1940 census, we can see that, in fact, when we look at the categories 20 to 25 and 30, we see that, in fact, there is an abnormally long bar here, a larger percentage of the population in that category, and these were, for the large part, sailors. And we saw with Professor Fredericks that they did indeed have an impact on the city of Long Beach, not just in 1940, but even more so as the war years went on through to 1945. So by 1940, we again find that the population is theoretically 99% white. This includes, as I noted earlier, Mexicans included in some category, probably as one of the white categories. We can also see that the city had not shown much growth, not surprisingly, during the 1930s, only about 15% growth in the city. But we can see an incredible growth in the city in terms of its area, with North Long Beach and areas in Wilmore City, and yes, mental blank. Yes, the area around Pacific, Wrigley, there we go. Wrigley, and expanding further down to the southeast to include the new island of Naples. And interestingly enough, this is a surprisingly important acquisition for the city. It's now Hartwell Park. But there was rapid annexation going on all over Southern California as a result of the growth of the population here. And the water department bought that strip of land and gave it to the city because you were not allowed to annex over another jurisdiction's property. So essentially, as Lakewood began to expand and annex, Hartwell Park acted as a block so that it kept that area of what became East Long Beach free of annexation by another local government. The 1940s, and especially from 1941 to 1965, was foreshadowed, demographic events were foreshadowed by events during 1930s when the Okies, so-called, from the lower Great Plains, due to the Dust Bowl, moved into Southern California. While they mainly went to the Central Valley, some of them did come to the area around Los Angeles. But the really remarkable change came during the war years as war industries developed in the Southern California area, especially in Long Beach, as people came to support the naval operations here, so that we find that the Navy and the war industries began to draw people from the Midwest. Iowa by the Sea became a reality during this period, from other parts of the eastern United States, and perhaps most importantly, demographically, people who were African American from East Texas and Louisiana. And while the migrations of African Americans from the South to places like Chicago and Detroit are perhaps better known, this was a major demographic change for Southern California and certainly for the city of Long Beach. And as they came here, they began to settle in an area around what became the 6th Councilmanic District, the area just below Signal Hill. And at this same time, we were having Filipinos on the west side, on the west part of the city, because Filipinos were the only foreign nationals allowed to serve in U.S. warships. They served as stewards, as cooks, and other jobs that were essentially non-fighting Navy positions. So we began to have a more diverse population created in the 1940s with African Americans, the Latinos who had been here for some time, and Filipinos beginning to create their own neighborhoods and their own retail and commercial facilities. A Congo Club was mentioned. It became a very famous area. Movie stars from Hollywood came down to the Congo Club, and in fact, there was a very growing and diverse population in the city of Long Beach. We see after the war that we have the creation of what came to be known for those of us growing up in Ohio, the California lifestyle. It was characterized by the spread of single-family residential developments, very large, expansive areas, low density, and the freeways, which began to spread as a network across Southern California, certainly through Long Beach, and the automobile became the way of life. It became what you had to have to get around in Southern California, and it was a real tragedy that the red car lines disappeared. Think what they would do today in terms of helping us get around Southern California. The way that this happened in Long Beach and in other parts of the US really was what came to be called the GI Bill. The GI Bill was established in 1944, and it allowed veterans to get health care, to create hospitals here. We have a VA hospital, and we had a naval hospital up on Carson on the 605. They began to have low-interest mortgages so they could buy those houses that were being developed in the spreading areas in the Southern California area. They were also able to get stipends to help with their expenses, and they, most importantly, began to get help with their education. So not only did they have health care, education, and inexpensive mortgages, but they had a confidence that they no longer had to worry about during the war years and the Depression years. The birth rate had dropped significantly in America during the Depression and the war years. This is typical of demographics. If there is uncertainty, people begin to delay having their children. And the result is what is called a demographic rebound, where people suddenly, when the pressure is off, begin to have those children they didn't have before. And as a result, Long Beach's population character began to change, and we had these veterans who now were able to get educated, to get a house, to have health care, having families. And they really did have families. We find that while not much change had taken place by 1950, the population pressure was beginning to grow, and by Cal State Long Beach was established in 1949, which added an additional draw to Long Beach. We find that by 1960, the eastern Long Beach area had been incorporated into the city, and it was rapidly becoming areas of residential use. 35 families a day at one point were moving into these new houses. There's a famous photo of Lakewood, actually, but it could have just as easily been in Long Beach, of a sort of aerial view of a housing development with moving trucks at virtually every house. It was an incredible period of growth, and it set the pattern for much of post-war America in the housing development, the single-family residences. Lakewood, of course, is considered to be the primary example of this kind of development. And we see that Long Beach now becomes a really large city. It has shown real growth. The population is almost 345,000 people. And between 1940 census and the 1960 census, Long Beach added almost 180,000 people. That is tremendous growth in a very short period of time. So that Long Beach, during the war years, became a more diverse population. It became a younger population. It became a population that was now being better educated, was being more prosperous with the boom of the 1950s. And in fact, Long Beach was considered to be a major metropolitan area. At the moment, Long Beach is the 7th largest city in the state of California. It was the 5th when I came here in 1992, but we're a constrained city. We can't spread out and grow like Fresno or some of the other cities. And I'm glad of that, actually. And it also became a city that was typified by villages within the city. There were different areas of the city that were known as specific neighborhoods, and Bixby Knolls, Cow Heights, Alamedas Heights, Belmont Heights were all there, and Long Beach became a very vibrant community. However, as we get to the 1970s, we find that this population that was so young and dynamic during the 50s and 60s is beginning to age, and we're having a creation of what are called empty nesters, households on the east side where the children were growing up and leaving home and going out, and we began to have many of the residences on the east side being just a couple, and an increasingly elderly couple. This did not bode well for the city of Long Beach to have an aging population. And while we're not going to go into it today because we're focusing on the World War II period, the third immigrant population boom, with people moving from Central America, from as far away as South America, and certainly from Mexico, but from the Pacific Rim, Cambodians, Koreans, Chinese, people from Southeast Asia, some people from India began to come in and provided a new, young, vibrant population. And this, of course, has made Long Beach in 2000 census to be the most ethnically diverse city in the United States, 65,000 or larger. So Long Beach has had an amazing demographic career in just a little over a century. And it has provided Long Beach with, for me, a very interesting place to study demographics, and for you, a community that has incredible food diversity, has incredible holiday diversity, and I think you would agree Long Beach has become a really ideal place in which to live. Thank you very much.